On the night of November 7th, 2008, in the quiet town of Hollow Ridge, Arkansas, 9-year-old Emma Raynor kissed her mother goodnight and curled up under her pink comforter with her kitten by her side. It was an ordinary act of childhood, the last moment of peace before a nightmare began. The next morning, her mother returned from work to find the back door wide open, the bed empty, and the kitten locked inside the closet, crying to be let out, a chilling clue that something was terribly wrong. Within hours, hundreds of neighbors and volunteers poured into the woods and fields, shouting Emma's name into the November air. They searched the creeks, the barns, the limestone caves that surrounded the town. Hope turned to fear. The porch light at the Raynor house stayed on night after night, a desperate signal from a mother waiting for her child who never came home. For 8 long years, Hollow Ridge lived with silence, until a group of archaeology students stumbled on a scrap of pink fabric buried near Cedar Sinkhole, 12 miles away. The discovery reopened a mystery that had haunted the Ozarks and led investigators back to someone the family once trusted completely. What happened to Emma Raynor? And how could someone so familiar hide such darkness for so long? Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. What city, what state? And don't forget to subscribe, follow the channel, and turn on the bell so you never miss the stories that seek justice for those who can no longer speak. Hollow Ridge, Arkansas, 2008. A place where time itself seemed to move a little slower. The world's noise dulled by endless stretches of farmland and the gentle hush of pine trees. The town was a tapestry of small moments, the slap of a screen door in the morning, the sweet aroma of bread baking at the lone corner store, the faded laughter of children drifting across yards where grass grew a little too wild. Here, everyone knew everyone, and trust was as common as the dusty pickup trucks parked outside each weather-beaten home. Doors were left unlocked at night, the unspoken promise that this was a safe place, untouched by the darkness that haunted bigger towns. On a cold Friday evening, a pale silver moon hung over the Raynor house like a watchful eye. It was a modest wooden place at the edge of town, set back from the gravel road and framed by a tired picket fence. Inside, Emma Raynor, a bright 9-year-old with chestnut hair and a scatter of freckles, lay on her belly atop a pink comforter. Her small bedroom was a world of color and innocence. Sketches of cats, real and imagined, adorned every surface. Each was a miniature window into her hopes and joys. There were little poems taped to the walls, scribbled in wobbly cursive, alongside clippings from art magazines she'd begged her mother to buy at the gas station. Emma's fingers, stained with marker ink, traced over a new drawing. A fluffy orange tabby perched atop a rainbow. She squinted, tongue poking from the corner of her mouth, lost in concentration. Beyond her door, the familiar sounds of home played. The kettle hissing, the low hum of the old refrigerator, the faint creak of floorboards under her mother's quick steps. Melissa Raynor, just 32 but with worry lines that made her seem older, was in her faded work uniform, packing a lunch into a brown paper bag. She worked the late shift at the gas station on the edge of town, a job she'd taken after her husband's sudden death 3 years before. Money was tight. Nights were long and lonely, but Melissa clung to routine, a lifeline in her world turned upside down. Before she left for work, Melissa knelt by Emma's bed, smoothing back her daughter's hair with a tired but tender hand. "I'll be home before morning, sweetheart. Get some sleep," she whispered, pressing a kiss to Emma's forehead. The girl nodded, yawning, eyes already half closed as she reached for the battered plush kitten that guarded her pillow. The front door clicked shut behind Melissa, and Emma listened to the soft purr of her mother's car fading into the distance. The house seemed to exhale, settling into the hush of nighttime, shadows growing long across the wallpaper. Outside, a wind picked up, rattling the loose gutter and sending dry leaves scuttling across the porch. For a long while, all was peaceful. But sometimes, peace is just a pause before everything changes. Hours slipped by. The clock on Emma's nightstand blinked from midnight to 1, then 2. Down the hall, the radiator clanked and hissed, old pipes groaning with the cold. Emma, restless in her sleep, tossed and murmured, a bad dream flickering beneath her closed eyelids. Her kitten, a wiry gray stray named Whiskers, pawed at the closet door, mewling softly, but Emma was too deep in dreams to notice. Unseen by her, outside on the street, a battered red pickup truck slowed to a crawl. Its headlights swept over the frost-tipped grass and the sagging porch. For a moment, the engine idled, the vehicle barely visible behind the tangle of bare-limbed trees. Then, abruptly, the engine cut off. The only sound was the wind and the faint, far-off barking of a dog. Inside the house, Whiskers darted away, squeezing into the shadows. The air grew heavy with a different kind of silence, dense, expectant, as if the very walls were holding their breath. At 3:07 a.m., a neighbor across the street, a light sleeper, roused by an uneasy feeling, heard that truck's engine start up again, then sputter, then stop. She peered out from behind her curtain, eyes squinting against the darkness, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Maybe just Tommy Hayes, she thought. Returning late from the bar, or dropping off some tool he'd borrowed. It was nothing worth calling about. She let the curtain fall, never realizing she was the last person to hear that sound before everything in Hollow Ridge would change. Dawn crept slowly over the Ozarks. Gray mist curled along the creek, and the first birds began to sing. Melissa's car crunched up the gravel drive just after 7. She yawned, rubbed her eyes, and fumbled with her keys, her mind on coffee and the warm bed waiting inside. As she approached the back door, a chill ran through her, a sixth sense, warning her that something was wrong. The door was open, swinging gently in the breeze. She frowned, heart picking up speed, thinking maybe she'd forgotten to lock it. That was rare, but not impossible. Stepping inside, the cold bit through her jacket. The living room was quiet, except for the ticking of the clock and the distant hum of traffic on the main road. "Emma?" she called, her voice echoing down the hall. No answer. She moved through the house, her steps quickening, a thin thread of fear pulling tighter with every empty room. Emma's bed was untouched, the blanket trailing to the floor, a single sock lying abandoned near the edge. The pink bicycle, her pride and joy, sat under the porch, untouched. In the corner, Whiskers was trapped inside the closet, pawing and crying to be let out. A strange, unsettling detail. Emma would never do that. Melissa's breath caught in her chest. The peaceful rhythm of Hollow Ridge shattered in an instant. Emma Raynor was gone, and with her disappearance, the nightmare began. Hollow Ridge was the kind of rural town that might be overlooked by travelers speeding down the state highway. With just one main road slicing through its heart, a scattering of low wooden buildings, and endless acres of fields and oak woods, the place seemed protected from the outside world by distance and time. Most of the houses were old, patched together with fresh boards and paint every few years by the hands of those who lived there. The people of Hollow Ridge shared everything: gossip, casserole recipes, worry, and especially now, a sense of growing unease. Emma Raynor was known by nearly everyone. She was a gentle, shy child, more likely to be found crouched in the grass watching ants than running with the other children. She had big hazel eyes that seemed to absorb every detail, a quick, shy smile, and a quiet kindness that made even the stray animals trust her. Teachers at Hollow Ridge Elementary would often find her, long after the bell, lost in her sketchbook, drawing cats and wildflowers, and sometimes, when she thought no one was watching, her mother's face surrounded by sunlight. In her school journal, she had written in careful, looping handwriting, "I want to be an artist so I can draw my mom smiling every day." Melissa Raynor, her mother, had built her world around Emma. After the tragic car accident that took her husband 3 years before, Melissa became the sole provider, working long hours at the gas station on Route 17. She was only 32, but her hair was streaked with worry, and her hands had grown calloused from endless shifts and home repairs. She did everything she could to keep their tiny house warm, the cupboards stocked, and Emma's life as normal as possible. People in town admired her. Some pitied her, but no one doubted her strength. In the rare hours when Melissa wasn't working, she and Emma would walk along the Miller Creek, collecting stones and sharing stories that belonged only to them. But Melissa hadn't been alone in raising Emma. After her husband's death, Tommy Hayes, an old friend of the family, had stepped in to help. Tommy was a big, barrel-chested man in his early 40s, with a laugh as rough as gravel. He'd grown up with Melissa's late husband and was always around to fix a broken pipe, mend a fence, or tinker with the engine of Melissa's aging sedan. Emma called him Uncle Tommy and never remembered a time when he hadn't been part of their lives. To the townspeople, Tommy was dependable, a bit rough around the edges, but loyal, a fixture in the community who knew everyone's story and secret. More recently, there was Jake Miller, Melissa's boyfriend, a newer presence in the Raynor household. At 33, Jake was younger than Tommy by several years, thinner, with restless blue eyes and a quiet, withdrawn manner. He'd moved into the garage after a messy divorce left him with nowhere else to go. He mostly kept to himself, working odd jobs, sometimes staring for hours out at the fields as if haunted by things he never spoke about. There were rumors, little run-ins with the law, a night spent in county jail for public disturbance, but nothing too alarming in a town where nearly everyone nursed some small scandal. Emma, sensitive to the moods of adults, had grown used to Jake's unpredictable silences and the way he hovered on the fringes of the family. She was polite, but never quite at ease in his presence. Still, Hollow Ridge was the sort of place where people tried not to judge too harshly. Forgiveness was a necessity in a town so small. The community itself moved in rhythm with the seasons. Spring meant muddy boots and the scent of honeysuckle, while autumn brought bonfires and laughter echoing down the lanes. The elementary school was a single-story building with squeaky floors and a playground patched with gravel. The town's single gas station, Melissa's workplace, served as a gathering spot where farmers talked weather and teenagers bought sodas on summer afternoons. On Sundays, families crowded into the old white-steepled church at the edge of the woods, prayers rising with the morning mist. Beneath its quiet exterior, Hollow Ridge was a web of connections, friendships, rivalries, secrets that ran back generations. People helped one another not because they had to, but because no one else would. The loss of a child in such a place was unthinkable. Children here belonged to everyone. When Emma Raynor vanished, It was as if the entire town lost its sense of safety overnight. In the days before her disappearance, Emma had seemed happy. She'd brought home a stray kitten, carefully wrapping it in a towel and pleading with Melissa to let her keep it. She'd drawn a picture for her teacher, a crayon sun shining over the Raynor house. But beneath these ordinary moments, an unease had begun to take root. Snatches of adult conversation hushed when she entered the room, the way her mother lingered a little longer at her bedside, as if memorizing the shape of her child's face in sleep. No one could have known that in a matter of hours, Hollow Ridge would become the center of a nightmare, a place where trust would fracture and suspicion would seep into every relationship. The fields and woods that once offered freedom would soon become places of dread, their silence broken by the search for a missing girl, whose absence was like a wound in the heart of the town. And so, as the sun rose over Hollow Ridge on that fateful morning, the people of the town began their day unaware that their world had already changed forever. Morning light slipped quietly across the Raynor yard, cold and thin, exposing every detail that had been hidden in the night. The grass glistened with frost, a shimmer that might have been beautiful on any other day. But nothing about that morning felt right. Melissa Raynor stood in the open doorway, her breath clouding in the chilly air, frozen by the emptiness of her home. The silence pressed in on her, a silence so deep it seemed unnatural, like the hush before a storm. She moved quickly, searching every corner, her mind racing to find logical explanations. Maybe Emma had woken early, gone next door, or wandered to the creek to look for her kitten. But Emma was not in the kitchen, not curled up on the worn living room couch, not hiding in any of the tiny corners that always seemed to offer comfort on days when she was sad or scared. The back door gaped open, the lock untouched, and cold air spilled into the house as if it too was searching for the missing girl. Panic welled inside Melissa. She called out for Emma, her voice cracking, then rising with each repetition. Still no answer. Her footsteps echoed through the little house, her mind snagging on every detail. The blanket half pulled to the floor, Emma's small pink bicycle still under the porch, her favorite shoes by the door. None of these belonged to a child who had simply wandered away. A soft, desperate mewling came from the hallway closet. Melissa rushed over, flinging the door open. Whiskers, Emma's kitten, darted out, trembling and wild-eyed. The closet door had been shut, barely closed, but closed enough. Melissa knew her daughter would never leave the kitten locked away, not even by accident. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Across the street, the neighbor who'd heard the strange noises in the night stepped out onto her porch, her robe pulled tight against the morning cold. She watched as Melissa moved back and forth through the yard, calling, searching, pleading with the universe to return what it had taken. Soon, the neighbor was dialing the sheriff's office, her hands shaking. Within the hour, 2 sheriff's deputies arrived, their patrol car crunching up the gravel driveway. One officer quietly took Melissa aside, asking questions in a voice meant to be calming. The other began a careful examination of the property, noting the muddy boot prints tracked across the living room floor, the streaks of dirt on the back step. He followed the trail out to the edge of the yard, where a long drag mark cut through the soil and into the tangle of weeds bordering the woods. It was as if something, or someone, had been pulled from the house into the darkness beyond. By mid-morning, news of Emma's disappearance swept through Hollow Ridge like a prairie fire. Melissa's hands shook as she called her mother in Oklahoma, her voice thin and barely holding together. Friends and neighbors appeared at the doorstep, faces pale and worried. trying to offer comfort, but finding only fear. The sheriff's deputies questioned everyone: Melissa, the neighbors, even Tommy Hayes, who arrived in his battered pickup, eyes red and jaw clenched with worry. Meanwhile, Jake Miller emerged from the garage, bleary-eyed and withdrawn, watching the commotion with a strange, haunted look. He told the deputies he hadn't heard anything unusual during the night, that he'd slept straight through, but his words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Detectives arrived from the county seat, armed with questions and crime scene tape. They combed through Emma's room, searching for signs of struggle, of forced entry, of anything out of place. Her sketchbook lay open on the bed, a fresh drawing waiting for her return. Her tiny backpack, still packed for school, leaned against the desk. The room was painfully ordinary, the chaos of childhood frozen in time. Outside, volunteers gathered. Some searched the woods behind the house. Others walked the length of Miller Creek, shouting Emma's name into the empty air. Flashlights swept over muddy banks and under thick thickets of bramble. The sound of footsteps and anxious voices filled the forest. But it was as if the land itself refused to yield its secrets. No one wanted to say the word, but fear hung over the town. Fear that someone had taken Emma, that something evil had come to Hollow Ridge in the dark. In a place where nothing like this had ever happened, everyone became both suspect and sentinel, watching one another with new suspicion. Late that afternoon, the detectives found a set of tire tracks leading away from the house, veering off toward the woods. The ground was soft from a recent rain, and the impression was deep and clear. Alongside the tracks, they found a broken length of pink thread, the same shade as the pajamas Emma wore to bed. The investigation pressed on as daylight faded. Search dogs arrived from the next county, their handlers speaking in low, urgent tones. They sniffed along the drag mark, their noses pressed to the ground, tails stiff with alert. But as darkness fell again over Hollow Ridge, the trail grew cold, and hope began to slip away. That night, the Raynor house stood dark and silent except for the porch light Melissa left burning. It would stay on, night after night, a lonely beacon in the darkness, a promise and a plea, waiting for the girl who did not come home. By the time the sun was fully overhead, the news had reached every home, shop, and lonely farmhouse in Hollow Ridge. The disappearance of Emma Raynor hit the town with a force that shattered its old sense of security, scattering fear and disbelief across breakfast tables and church pews alike. In a place where nothing truly terrible had ever happened, people looked at one another differently. Suspicion growing in the cracks of old friendships and trust turning brittle with the sudden knowledge that even here, evil could slip through the cracks. Police tape cordoned off the Raynor yard, fluttering in the chilly wind as law enforcement vehicles lined the street. The sheriff's department, usually dealing with lost pets and the occasional drunk driver, was suddenly at the center of a crisis that none of them had ever truly prepared for. Deputy Sanders, with 20 years on the job and a face weathered by Arkansas sun, tried to coordinate the chaos, his radio crackling with updates and false alarms. Within hours, the whole town mobilized. At the little brick firehouse, the chief called in every volunteer: farmers, teachers, retirees, teenagers who barely knew Emma but remembered her shy smile at the 4th of July picnic. A makeshift command center sprang up, tables covered in hand-drawn maps and highlighted search grids. Volunteers signed in and gathered supplies: flashlights, bottled water, walkie-talkies, orange vests that hung too large on thin shoulders. Someone passed around coffee in old thermoses, hands shaking not from caffeine but dread. By early afternoon, over 200 people had joined the search, They fanned out across fields, their voices carrying over the rolling grass and into the deep hush of the Miller Creek woods. Flashlights swept under fallen logs, poked into limestone caves, and flickered over shallow creeks made silver by the sun. Dogs barked and men called Emma's name until their throats were raw. Nobody wanted to be the one to find something. Yet everyone felt a terrible responsibility to keep looking. A group of older boys, sent to check an abandoned barn at the edge of town, returned pale and shaken after discovering nothing but dust and broken boards. A teacher from the school swore she heard a child's voice, a faint whisper, "Mom." Carried by the wind through the pines, the story rippled through the crowd. Hope and fear tangled together. But when they searched, they found only the echo of their own desperation. By dusk, flyers appeared on every pole, mailbox, and gas pump. Missing, 9-year-old Emma Raynor, brown hair, hazel eyes. Last seen at home on Friday night. If you have any information, contact Hollow Ridge Police. Melissa's co-workers printed copies at the gas station for free. The faces of children pressed against the glass windows, watching the grown-ups move with urgent, bewildered purpose. Their own world suddenly, irrevocably changed. Reporters arrived from the nearest city, their satellite vans crowding the narrow roads. The sight of TV cameras on the lawn turned the search into a spectacle, drawing out the curious and the frightened in equal measure. At the hastily arranged press conference, Melissa Raynor stood before a row of microphones, her face pale and raw from tears. The sheriff rested a heavy hand on her shoulder as she spoke, her voice trembling. "If someone has my little girl, please, please let her come home. She's just a child." Her words carried across the crowd and through the television screens, touching hearts far beyond Hollow Ridge. Night fell, cold and unyielding, but the searchers refused to stop. Bonfires sprang up along the edge of the woods, their flickering light a signal that hope still lived, if only barely. The porch light at the Raynor house, usually left off to save electricity, now burned all night, a beacon against the darkness. Melissa sat on the steps, clutching Emma's favorite drawing, a sunlit cat, and listening for any sound that might break the silence. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made her heart leap with terror and hope. Inside their homes, families double-checked their locks for the first time in years. Children slept in their parents' beds, seeking safety in the comfort of familiar arms. Conversations, once casual and easy, now circled around worry and fear. Mothers called their children home before the sun set. Fathers checked in on neighbors who never used to need checking. The community's routines were upended, replaced by a collective vigilance that bordered on paranoia. As the hours turned into days, exhaustion settled over the town like a heavy blanket. Search parties grew quieter, steps slower, but still they pressed on, down by the creek, through the muddy pastures, along back roads edged with frost. The promise of bringing Emma home was the only thing keeping some of them going. Their own lives paused in the shadow of her absence. Through it all, the Raynor porch light never went dark. It shone through wind and rain, its glow reaching across the yard and into the haunted woods, a silent signal, a mother's plea, and a town's stubborn refusal to surrender to despair. And as each night fell, Hollow Ridge waited, its people united by hope and heartbreak, while somewhere out there, the secret of Emma's disappearance remained hidden in the dark. As the frantic search began to slow, replaced by the stubborn dread that comes after hope has been wrung dry, Hollow Ridge's focus narrowed to a handful of faces, those closest to Emma, those whose lives had been tangled with the Raynor family long before the nightmare began. In a small town, the line between neighbor and suspect was thin and quickly crossed. The police, exhausted but determined, tightened their grip on every thread, no matter how frayed. Detective Cheryl Wyatt, new to the county but already hard-edged by experience, took the lead. She set up her temporary headquarters in the school principal's office, its walls lined with children's artwork and missing posters for Emma. Every scrap of evidence was sifted, cataloged, and mapped onto a whiteboard that quickly filled with names and timelines. Two men soon drew the brightest, harshest spotlight. First was Tommy Hayes, the family friend everyone called Uncle Tommy. He'd grown up in Hollow Ridge, helped build the Little League Diamond, and was the first to volunteer for every church roof repair. He'd been at the Raynor house more than once a week for years, fixing whatever was broken, always bringing treats for Emma. On the night of the disappearance, Tommy claimed he'd been watching a late football game at his friend Denny's trailer. He described the game in detail, right down to the botched field goal. But Denny's story, when pressed, was less certain. Worse still, a neighbor reported seeing Tommy's battered red pickup rolling down the back road toward the Miller Creek woods at around 3 miles in the morning, the exact time the Raynor neighbor had heard the engine in the dark. Detectives pulled Tommy in for questioning. He was nervous, fidgeting with the cap in his hands, his usually booming voice gone brittle. His alibi seemed to flicker beneath scrutiny, sometimes solid, sometimes full of small cracks. When they checked his boots, the treads matched the muddy prints that had stained the Raynor living room floor. Still, Tommy insisted he'd never hurt Emma. He choked back tears as he spoke, and Hollow Ridge found itself torn between what they had always believed and what suddenly seemed possible. Jake Miller, Melissa's boyfriend, was a different story, aloof, hard to read, and more a stranger in town despite living in the Raynor's garage. He had a restless, jumpy manner that drew suspicion before he even spoke. When detectives asked where he'd been that night, Jake said he'd slept through it all, headphones in, a habit from his time working nights at the poultry plant. But security footage from the gas station told another story. Jake had been seen on camera buying a 6-pack of beer at 2:12 a.m., just minutes from the Raynor home. When pressed about the discrepancy, Jake grew defensive, insisting he'd only stepped out for a drink and returned immediately. No one saw him return. No one could confirm his story after the timestamp on that security tape. Both men failed to provide solid alibis. Both, in their own ways, fit the uneasy shape of the community's suspicions. Yet, the investigation quickly proved to be more shadows than substance. Despite the drag marks in the yard, the matching boot prints, and the timelines that bent and buckled under questioning, no concrete evidence emerged. No blood, no weapon, no clear sign of a struggle beyond the open back door and the kitten locked away. Without a body, without a confession, and with the woods swallowing any lingering traces, the case drifted into that uncertain place where tragedy and rumor intertwine. As days turned into weeks, the town began to fracture under the strain. Old friends became wary. Conversations at the diner turned sharp, eyes flicking up whenever Tommy or Jake passed by. Parents clutched their children tighter, unwilling to let them walk alone even in daylight. The sheriff's office fielded daily calls about strange vehicles, unfamiliar faces, and half-remembered noises in the night. Hollow Ridge, once united by the search, was now split by fear and the awful reality that the answer might lie close to home. For Melissa Raynor, the ordeal was a spiral with no bottom. She spent her days in interviews, her nights by the phone, listening for news that never came. The porch light, her vigil, remained a lone point of hope. She watched the police come and go, watched suspicion harden into something colder, watched her own circle shrink as neighbors looked at her with pity, curiosity, and, worst of all, doubt. Detective Wyatt persisted. She scoured backgrounds, questioned coworkers, checked criminal records from counties away. She followed up on every tip, no matter how outlandish, hoping for the smallest break, a missed fingerprint, a camera that had caught a fleeing shape, a confession whispered in the dark. But the weeks blurred into months. Search parties grew smaller, then stopped altogether. Emma's posters faded, curling at the edges. Autumn bled into winter, and the case, for all the urgency that had once surrounded it, began to slip away. Emma Raynor was still missing, her absence now a silent weight carried by every person in Hollow Ridge. Her name became a prayer, a warning, a wound that refused to close, as the little town settled uneasily into the long, bitter wait for answers. As another cold Arkansas winter settled over Hollow Ridge, the frantic search for Emma Raynor faded into a somber routine of endurance. At first, the town had rallied, hope burning stubbornly through every disappointment. But as days turned to weeks, and weeks to months, that hope began to flicker and die, leaving only the numb ache of uncertainty. The porch lights that once blazed all night as silent prayers against the darkness slowly winked out, one by one, across the neighborhood. Only the Raynor porch remained lit, its glow a stubborn point of defiance and grief. Melissa Raynor's world shrank to a narrow corridor of waiting. She went through the motions, working her shifts, answering detectives' questions, attending church, but her heart remained in limbo. Each morning she woke, reaching for the sound of Emma's footsteps, and each night she sat on the porch, fingers wrapped around a cooling cup of coffee, scanning the empty road for some sign. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before dawn, she could almost hear her daughter's laughter, soft as wind through the trees, and for a heartbeat, hope would surge again, only to collapse under the weight of reality. The official investigation lumbered on. Arkansas State Police and later the FBI joined forces with the Hollow Ridge Sheriff's Department, forming a task force that mapped Emma's case against other disappearances across the Ozarks. Files stacked up on desks, interviews blurred together, and tireless agents retraced every step that had already been searched a dozen times. They analyzed every muddy boot print, every footprint in the woods, every grainy bit of security footage from nearby gas stations and truck stops. They interviewed convicted felons in faraway counties, sifted through the internet histories of anyone even remotely connected to the Raynor family, and compared Emma's disappearance to a handful of unsolved child abductions in neighboring states. Each promising lead dissolved into nothing, another dead end. Tommy Hayes and Jake Miller remained under suspicion, their lives upended by the relentless scrutiny. Tommy, once a fixture at church picnics and volunteer barbecues, withdrew from the community. People who used to wave to him on the street now crossed to the other side. Jake, never quite at home in Hollow Ridge, grew even more isolated, his reputation shadowed by rumors that clung long after detectives declared there wasn't enough evidence to charge either man. They became ghosts in their own lives, prisoners of the same suspicion that haunted every parent in town. In Emma's absence, Hollow Ridge changed. The rhythm of daily life slowed and grew cautious. Parents watched their children with wary eyes, forbidding them to wander far or stay out past dusk. Old routines, walking to school alone, biking down empty country roads, vanished. Some families left town, unable to bear the memory of what had been lost. Others clung more tightly to one another, determined to outlast the darkness. Years crept by. Emma's face, once bright on every flyer, every storefront window, began to fade, the colors leaching away with the seasons. At first, she was a headline, a breaking news segment, a plea from a mother broadcast across counties. But as time wore on, new tragedies replaced the old in the public's memory. The story of Emma Raynor became a cautionary tale told in hushed tones at the school, a ghost story for anxious children, a sorrow whispered by mothers who couldn't help but see their own daughters in the shadow of her absence. In 2010, 2 years after Emma disappeared, the authorities had no choice but to close the case. The file was marked unsolved and moved into a cold case archive in Little Rock, stacked with hundreds of others. Missing girls, lost boys, open wounds left to gather dust. Melissa Raynor, who had once clung to the hope of justice, now held only grief. The town, too, retreated, eager to reclaim a sense of normalcy but unable to fully forget. Yet for Melissa, the ritual of remembrance continued. Every year, on November 7th, the day Emma vanished, she returned to the empty house in Hollow Ridge. The yard grew wild. The paint peeled, but the porch light still glowed, drawing moths and memories to its pale circle of light. Melissa would stand on the threshold, a bouquet of white lilies trembling in her hands, and whisper a mother's promise into the silent rooms. The neighbors watched from behind their curtains, some wishing for the strength to comfort her, others simply wishing it all away. Emma's story settled into the bones of Hollow Ridge. At night, teenagers dared each other to walk the edge of Miller Creek, swearing they heard a child's voice on the wind. The woods grew darker, every snap of a twig a reminder that some secrets stay hidden for years, sometimes forever. Life crept on, marked by absences and anniversaries. But for Melissa, and for those who had loved Emma, the ache of not knowing was a wound that never healed, a silent, ceaseless question echoing through every quiet dawn and restless midnight. What happened to Emma Raynor? And so the years rolled forward, bearing the weight of a mystery that had no ending, only silence and longing left in its place. 8 years passed, marked by silent birthdays, withering bouquets, and the steady erosion of hope. For most of Hollow Ridge, Emma Raynor's disappearance had become a shadow that hovered at the edges of memory, a wound that had scabbed over, though the pain sometimes flared with the changing seasons. But for Melissa, each day was another reckoning with the unknown. Even after moving to Oklahoma to live with her mother, she carried the ache of absence with her, heavy as ever. June 2016 was shaping up to be unremarkable, the kind of humid, slow summer that turned even the smallest errands into acts of endurance. Hollow Ridge had shrunk in those years, a few more shops boarded up, new faces replacing old ones. But the woods and fields surrounding the town remained unchanged, vast and indifferent to the passage of time. Yet it was in these woods, at a site known as Cedar Sinkhole, 12 miles north of the old Raynor house, that the past would claw its way to the surface. A group of archaeology students from the University of Missouri had set up camp, eager to uncover remnants of ancient settlers. Their laughter carried over the clearing, punctuated by the sharp ring of shovels striking earth. On the second morning, the sun already hot and merciless, one student unearthed something unexpected, a small scrap of pink fabric, faded and thin, the cartoon cat on it just barely visible beneath years of mud. She paused, curiosity shifting to confusion. The material was modern, not the centuries-old remnants they sought. The team leader took charge, carefully isolating the fragment. He turned it over in his gloved hands, studying the worn edges, the stubborn persistence of a little girl's world captured in a single, stubborn scrap. Instinct told him this was not their history to claim, so he called the local sheriff. Within hours, the dig site was cordoned off, and the police combed through the dirt with delicate brushes and gloved hands. The air was thick with tension, each discovery weighted with the possibility of closure or heartbreak. Beneath a layer of compacted earth, a forensic team unearthed small human remains, fragile bones, wisps of brown hair matted to a sun-bleached skull, a striped pink and white sock still clinging to a tiny foot. A hush settled over the clearing, broken only by the click of cameras and the quiet, professional urgency of law enforcement. Word spread fast. By evening, the edges of Cedar Sinkhole were ringed by yellow tape and anxious faces. Reporters and camera crews returned, but this time, Hollow Ridge did not welcome their attention. The town braced for a verdict it had always dreaded, every household suddenly reliving the pain they had learned to bury. The remains were rushed to the state crime lab. DNA analysis began, methodical and unrelenting. Days blurred into nights as the experts worked, cross-referencing the samples with files marked Emma Raynor. On a Tuesday, thick with rain, the results arrived, confirmation of what the town had already guessed. The child found at Cedar Sinkhole was Emma Raynor. The news rippled through Hollow Ridge, reopening old wounds with brutal efficiency. People wept openly at the gas station and in church pews, some in mourning, others in guilt for having moved on. Melissa, living 3 hours away by then, received the call she had both longed for and feared most. For a moment, she could only sit, the phone heavy in her hand, as all the years of waiting and wondering dissolved into a single, shattering truth. But the story was not finished. Forensics soon uncovered a final, damning clue. Embedded in the fabric of Emma's pajama top, and later confirmed by preserved DNA found at the site, was a trace of genetic material. It did not match Jake Miller, nor any stranger in the national database. Instead, it matched Tommy Hayes, the once beloved family friend who had been at every picnic, every holiday, every anxious search party in those first frantic days. The revelation detonated through Hollow Ridge. The image of Tommy, helpful, jovial, always ready with a joke, was replaced in an instant by suspicion and horror. Old memories warped, his eagerness to help in the search, his awkward silences under questioning, the way he had quietly withdrawn when the case turned cold. Each moment was now viewed through a new, terrible lens. The very person so many had trusted became the face of betrayal. Detectives moved quickly. Tommy's name was entered into every system, his photo circulated across county lines. The man who once fixed leaking faucets and cheered at Little League games was now a wanted fugitive, his whereabouts unknown. The town watched the news in disbelief, wrestling with a fresh wave of shock and grief. Some clung to doubt, unable to accept the fall of someone so deeply woven into their lives. Others felt a strange relief, the agony of uncertainty replaced at last by the cold, hard edge of truth. In the days that followed, rain washed over Hollow Ridge, the streets empty and quiet, as if the whole world was holding its breath. Closure, when it came, was jagged, part healing, part fresh agony. For Melissa Raynor, for Emma's classmates now grown, and for every parent who had checked their locks at night, the discovery at Cedar Sinkhole was the end of a long silence and the beginning of a new reckoning. The revelation of Emma Raynor's fate and the DNA match to Tommy Hayes swept through Hollow Ridge like a violent summer storm. In the weeks that followed, news of the discovery and the hunt for Tommy became a fixture on every local radio and television station. For many, it felt as if the town itself were holding its breath, suspended between disbelief and a desperate hunger for justice. No one could look back on the years since Emma's disappearance without re-examining every memory and every casual moment with Tommy. The search for him became an obsession, not just for the police but for a community needing closure. Far from Hollow Ridge, in the wooded backroads of Franklin County, Tennessee, Tommy Hayes was found. He had taken up residence in a small, run-down mobile home at the edge of an overgrown lot, living under a different name. His world shrunk to a battered trailer, stacks of unopened mail, and a single window through which he watched the world but seldom emerged. When Tennessee authorities arrived one March morning in 2018, they found him sitting at a kitchen table littered with empty beer cans, a faded photograph of a much younger Emma tucked into the corner of a cracked mirror. He did not fight, nor did he protest his innocence as they read him his rights and led him away in handcuffs. Back in Arkansas, detectives and prosecutors gathered to build their case. Evidence was cataloged: the scrap of pink pajamas, the traces of DNA, the decades-old reports of sightings and the statements from neighbors who remembered Tommy's red pickup in the darkness. Every small detail, once overlooked or dismissed as coincidence, became part of the mounting proof of his guilt. When confronted in the interrogation room, with the evidence laid out before him and a mountain of years collapsing around him, Tommy broke down. Gone was the jovial handyman, the loyal friend. In his place was a man aged by shame, his words coming in shuddering, broken fragments. He confessed, not in a torrent, but in slow, halting admissions, as if each word cost him some final piece of his dignity. He told investigators that on the night Emma disappeared, he had returned to the Raynor house under the pretense of retrieving a forgotten toolbox. He had not expected to see Emma awake, nor for her to greet him with the sleepy trust of a child who still believed in the goodness of grown-ups. Tommy explained, his eyes averted, that he called her outside, claiming her kitten had run off. In the shadowy yard, something inside him snapped. When Emma recognized his face and tried to run, panic took over. In a moment of terrible violence, he grabbed her, his hands closing around her small frame. What happened next, he could barely speak aloud. A tangle of fear, guilt, and horror that ended with Emma's life stolen, her breath silenced by a thin cord he found in the back of his truck. Afterward, in a state of shock, Tommy had carried Emma's body from the Raynor house, down a path only he knew, to Cedar Sinkhole. He covered her with leaves and debris, believing that rain and time would wash away all traces of his crime. But the past, he discovered, does not simply disappear. The land held its secrets for years, only to reveal them when the world was finally ready or in need of the truth. The trial that followed became a reckoning for Hollow Ridge. Melissa Raynor sat in the front row every day, clutching her daughter's old drawing, the one with the words, "Mom, you're my hero," written in bright, hopeful colors. The courtroom was packed, the gallery divided between those seeking answers and those who could not comprehend how someone so familiar, so trusted, could harbor such darkness. Tommy Hayes' confession left little room for doubt. but the pain of hearing the details spoken aloud reopened wounds that had barely begun to heal. The prosecution painted a picture of betrayal, the violation of trust, the destruction of innocence, and the terrible cost of ignoring small warning signs. The defense offered only the broken remnants of a life gone wrong, but no comfort for the enormity of the crime. In 2019, after a short, somber deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict of first-degree murder and child sexual assault. Tommy Hayes was sentenced to death, his fate sealed as the town he once called home turned away for good. In the months that followed, Melissa tried to piece together a life from what remained. She visited Emma's grave with lilies and long, silent prayers, speaking softly to the child she lost, but never stopped loving. The house in Hollow Ridge was sold to strangers, the porch light finally extinguished. Yet for the people who had once filled that house with laughter and hope, Emma's memory endured. A reminder of vulnerability, resilience, and the thin line that separates trust from betrayal. For Hollow Ridge, the truth offered a kind of closure but left behind scars that would never fully heal. Neighbors who had once greeted each other with open hearts now locked their doors and guarded their children with new wariness. But in small ways, the community found strength, in the kindness of friends who had never left, in the courage of a mother who demanded answers, and in the shared resolve that such evil would never again find easy passage through their quiet town. Long after the verdict, the story of Emma Raynor lingered in Hollow Ridge like the mournful echo of a train passing in the night. Her disappearance and the revelations that followed left scars on the town and everyone touched by the case. But as months gave way to years, Emma's name joined a haunting roll call of children whose innocence had been stolen, not just in Arkansas, but across the country. Her face, forever 9 years old, framed by chestnut hair and a shy, hopeful smile, became a silent testimony to all the families who had lost what they could never reclaim. As people slowly tried to move forward, the Raynor case began to take on the contours of legend. It was a story told in classrooms as a warning, murmured among parents who gripped their children's hands a little tighter in the grocery store parking lot, and shared in the soft hush of bedtime, a reminder to be careful, even with those you think you know. For Melissa Raynor, it was more than a story. It was an unending ache, but also a call to honor her daughter's memory in every way she could. Each year on Emma's birthday, Melissa visited the cemetery with a single white lily, tracing her daughter's name with trembling fingers, whispering the stories that would have filled the years they lost. But the power of Emma's story did not end with Hollow Ridge. Reporters who had covered the trial dug deeper into the similarities between Emma's case and others, connecting threads across rural America. It became clear that Emma's fate echoed that of another girl, Rowan Damia Ford, who vanished in Missouri in 2007, just a year before Emma's fictional disappearance. Rowan, like Emma, was 9 years old, sweet and gentle, loved by her family, and lost in the dark silence of her own home. Rowan's story was both inspiration and tragedy. On a November evening, her mother returned home to find the back door open, the house strangely still, and Rowan gone. For days, the town of Stella, Missouri, searched every field and creek, following a trail of dread and hope. The search ended in heartbreak. A family friend, trusted for years, was arrested, and Rowan's body was found 6 days later in a cave in McDonald County. The pain of betrayal, the shattering of trust, and the loneliness of grief all unfolded as the town tried to understand how the familiar could become monstrous overnight. In both stories, the culprits were not strangers lurking in the night, but men welcomed into the fold of family and community. The trials revealed the slow erosion of boundaries, the overlooked warning signs, and the heartbreaking truth that danger is sometimes found where it is least expected. In Rowan's case, Christopher Collings, known and trusted, was convicted and ultimately executed in 2024, after years of legal appeals and public debate. Emma Raynor's fictional story, though shaped for narrative and voice, became a vessel for these real-world truths. Her mother's sorrow, the town's panic and shame, the twisted path from innocence to horror, all these reflected the actual suffering of families like Rowan's and countless others whose children had vanished into the unknown. The storytelling gave voice to the silence, insisting that these children would not be forgotten, that their lives and losses demanded remembrance and justice. As the years passed, advocates and activists invoked both Emma and Rowan in campaigns for child safety. Their stories were used in training programs for teachers, social workers, and law enforcement, each retelling urging vigilance. "Trust is sacred," the brochures read. "Never ignore your instincts." Schools hung posters in hallways and classrooms, faces of missing children staring out at new generations, each pair of eyes a question and a warning. Lawmakers pushed for stricter background checks, better community reporting, and reforms that might catch evil before it slips inside. In Hollow Ridge and Stella, healing was slow. Families that had once left doors unlocked at night now kept porch lights burning and locks double-checked. Communities became more watchful, sometimes suspicious, struggling to balance the longing for safety with the danger of seeing the worst in those around them. Still, they came together each year, at vigils, memorial walks, and gatherings in school gyms, to honor the lives lost, share stories, and raise awareness. Melissa Raynor, invited to speak at one such event, shared her message with trembling conviction. "If you have any doubt, speak. Even the smallest sign can save a life. Don't let another mother sit in the dark, waiting for a knock that never comes." Emma Raynor and Rowan Ford became more than names on case files. They became symbols of lost innocence and hard-won justice. Their stories, so similar and so shattering, taught hard lessons. That evil often wears a familiar face, that trust must be earned and protected, and that the search for truth, however painful, is the only path to healing. The towns they left behind would never be the same, but through the persistence of memory and the strength to speak out, Emma and Rowan became, at last, voices that would never fade. Years have passed since Emma Raynor's story first unsettled the stillness of Hollow Ridge. The old house, once alive with laughter and light, belongs now to another family. Time has softened the sharp edges of grief for some, but for others, especially Melissa, the ache of loss remains an unyielding presence, woven into every quiet hour. Yet even as the world has moved on, the legacy of Emma and the lesson her life imparts has taken on a larger, enduring shape. In Hollow Ridge, some things have changed forever. Parents walk their children to the school bus, hands clasped tightly, watchful even in daylight. Newcomers are met with both warmth and gentle scrutiny. At dusk, porch lights still burn, a silent promise of protection, a ritual born of heartbreak. The annual vigil for Emma, once marked by tears and protest, has become a solemn tradition of remembrance. Each November, the community gathers on the school lawn with candles, pictures, and whispered prayers. Melissa, always at the center, stands beside a table adorned with her daughter's artwork and the drawing that says, "Mom, you're my hero." In the glow of those small flames, neighbors rediscover a fragile but genuine sense of unity, their grief transformed into resolve. Emma's story, though rooted in tragedy, has sparked conversations far beyond the boundaries of her town. Her name is spoken at child safety conferences, printed on flyers distributed by advocacy groups, and taught in classrooms as a vital lesson. The warning is clear. Evil is not always an intruder from outside. Sometimes it lives in the heart of the familiar, wearing the face of a friend, a neighbor, even a trusted caregiver. Emma's disappearance, like Rowan Ford's in the real world, shattered the illusion that danger always comes with a stranger's knock. It taught a generation of parents and children that trust is sacred and fragile. In the years following the trial, Melissa Raynor has become an advocate herself. At first, her words were halting, choked with pain, but as time passed, she found the courage to speak with conviction. She travels to neighboring towns, stands before crowds both large and small, and tells Emma's story in her own words. Her message is simple, urgent, and unforgettable. Look out for your children. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, say something, no matter how small it seems. She reminds parents and teachers that vigilance saves lives, that no detail is too trivial to notice, and that the safety of a child is always worth the discomfort of asking hard questions. Melissa's voice, once shaky, now carries the weight of experience. She has sat with families enduring their own nightmares, offering comfort that only someone who has walked that path can give. She brings flowers to Emma's grave and to Rowan's as well, honoring not just her daughter, but all the children whose stories have ended before their time. In these quiet acts of remembrance, she finds a measure of peace, her love enduring beyond the reach of violence and loss. Across the country, the ripple effects of Emma's case continue to shape how communities respond to danger. Law enforcement agencies have adopted new protocols for missing children, responding faster and more comprehensively. Schools hold assemblies about personal safety and recognizing warning signs. Teachers are trained to see not only bruises and absences, but changes in a child's spirit, subtle clues that something might be wrong. Parents swap stories and advice, forging informal networks of care. The tragedy that once isolated Hollow Ridge has, over time, become a thread that connects families everywhere, strengthening their collective resolve to protect the innocent. Yet the work is not finished. New names appear on posters and news reports every year. Some stories end with joyful reunions, others with heartbreak, but all are reminders that vigilance must be unending. As Melissa often says at the end of her speeches, some wounds can only be healed by the truth, and some truths demand that we never look away. The final lesson of Emma Raynor's story is not just about tragedy, but about courage, love, and the hard work of building a world where children are truly safe. It is about the strength found in speaking up, in refusing to ignore that quiet alarm in your heart, in demanding answers even when it is difficult. It is about honoring the lost by fighting for the living. May Rowan Ford and Emma Raynor rest in peace, their memories not fading into old case files, but enduring in the hearts of all who have heard their stories. May their families, and the families of so many others, find the strength to carry on. And may every community remember, sometimes the smallest act of vigilance, the briefest hesitation, or the faintest doubt can save a life. For those listening, let this story be both a memorial and a call to action. Light a candle, hold your children close, And always, always trust your instincts. In memory of Emma, Rowan, and every child still waiting for justice, stand guard, speak out, and never forget. Subscribe to the channel to honor their memory and to help us uncover justice for the stories that never found an ending.